science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash. It's the middle of summer 2021 and you are once again listening to Architecture Talk. And today we have part 2 of my panel conversation on is mid-century Indian modernism still relevant today, that I held a few weeks ago with fantastic scholars, the quadrumvirate of Mark Jarzombek of MIT, Tony Vidler of Cooper Union, Sunil Khilnani of Ashoka University, and Partha Mitter, Professor Emeritus from the University of Essex. If you haven't, it'd be a great idea to listen to the first part of the conversation released last week, where we set up the criteria and understanding of the emplacement of mid-century modernism in the historical arc, so to speak. And this second part is where we have a little more freewheeling discussion, contending the legacy of mid-century modernism, its affect, its continuity, its transformation, its challenges, and more directly address the question of whether it has become passé or is it something that is still an ongoing project. I enjoyed this very much and I learned a lot about it, and it enabled me to think differently about what mid-century modernism is, and I say that advisedly, is rather than was, and I hope you find it similarly useful and instructive. I hope you enjoy this conversation.
So let's bring in the question of ethics between the questions of appearance and things as they are, and modernism constructed itself or articulated itself, and even in its moorings to Nehruvian nationalism, as some kind of an ethical situating of the socius, a rethinking of times, right? I mean, so that was my part of the motivation behind how things look modern and how things are modern is the differentiation. That was an important criteria. So what is the status of that, today, 70 years on, 50 years, 60 years on? Does that all become obsolete? Or is it, in a sense, the ethical imperative of modernism or an Indian nationalism, does it still stand, or is that to be critiqued? How do we produce that critique? I mean, I'm trying to turn to this whole sort of climate question and the energy question. Is like, the sort of series of ethical internal critiques of modernism, which were started in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s. These are still very much in play. But at the same time, there is also a dismissal and destruction of modernist architecture on its aesthetic grounds, which is that it is simply out of touch. So well, those two things, go ahead.
No, I think you're right in the sense that there is, on the one hand, devaluation, and certainly the word brutalist, which journalists picked up from the early critiques of modernity, didn't help the aesthetic evaluation of the buildings that are being threatened. But they are buildings that were built at a time when CIAM, after the war, was attempting to, as José Luis said, develop a new monumentality out of the rather abstract language of modernism, and that was being demonstrated in the new city halls. Think of Boston, the new skyscrapers, the new city centers. Think of Birmingham. All those infrastructural plus civic buildings are being built at that time as sort of restoring the center of the city, or as more viciously moving out the poor inhabitants from the centers of cities for business accommodations. But all those buildings are, in fact, were symbols of a certain kind of civic modernity. And two things are happening. One, land values are increasing to the point that the demolition and reconstruction is more economic in terms of profit than restoration. And they are literally obsolete. I mean, the Birmingham Library, for example, which is one of the triumphal modernist libraries in the 50s, was intimately linked to the inner ring road, which was also reinforced concrete. Once that inner ring road was deemed obsolete, the library had to go. It was all connected, right? So that there's a certain moment where the total planning that was so important of interdisciplinary between urbanism, infrastructure, and architecture moment. You think of the new towns where all those things were linked. Once they became obsolete, or one item became obsolete, then land values became much more important. And also the triumph of neoliberal capitalism is much more important. I think on the other hand, though, I think that the sense of from now is that the crises that we're facing in terms of everything from pandemics to environment to major social crises, the major political crises, they kind of wipe out talk about aesthetics. They wipe out talk about the individual building. As long as you can make the individual building out of materials that are recyclable or renewable, as long as you can make it ethically reasonable in terms of the space requirements and its, if you like, modesty in relationship to accommodation, then that's okay. And then beyond that, we are into a much, much more catastrophic stage of thought. Apocalyptic stage of thought, where the small-scale building, even the monument, and especially the monument, becomes completely out of the question. It's not a problem anymore.
We have some major nationalistic architecture being designed and built today. I mean, architecture is still being accessed as I don't know how the materials and recycled material question bears into this. But I think, still there are major structures being built in Delhi and in other parts of the world as the expression of a new nationalism. But this is a nationalism that does not index itself to, the 19th, early 20th century modernist idea of nationalism. So what happened here? Go ahead, Sunil.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things to say about that, but I mean, just a couple that I'll throw in at this point. I mean, I think here one has to recall the historically complex relationship between, or rather, historical complexity of the politics of modernism, and aesthetic modernism very often went with reactionary politics. Wyndham Lewis, Ezra Pound, etc. Corbusier himself. This idea that you could be aesthetically at the edge of things, but your politics harked back to a world of order, a world of where people knew their place, of deference, of authority. Corbusier's figure of the regulator, the administrative political figure who would keep everything all in order. And in a curious way, I mean, I think that what you're seeing today in India is you're seeing a kind of that strand of modernism actually finding some life. So in a combination of, someone like Modi and his chief architect, Bimal Patel, I mean, you see this combination of this distinct, to use the terms you used earlier, being modern and looking modern. You see the desire to look modern. And to pick up to combine a certain kind of, technological aesthetics, a kind of IIT aesthetics with reactionary politics. There, I think the difference there between the earlier moment of nationalism and the current moment, very broadly put, might be put this way, which is that in the earlier moment with Nehru and others and his generation, I think there was a sense that the state had a kind of gently corrective role in terms of the society. So if you look at the Indian Constitution and the early decades of the state, the project was to gradually, patiently move the society in a more just, more fair, more open and democratic direction. The current view of what the function of the state is that somehow it should be expressive of the society as it is, that it's not this gently corrective function, but it should be expressive of some definition of the culture or some claimed view of the majority, that that's the function of what the state is, and therefore the architecture of the state and the products of the state should be some authentic expression of, rather than some, in a sense, pedagogically sort of process of directing the society gently in a particular way. And I think that there's been this shift that now the state belongs to the real people, the authentic voice of the people, and that voice must be heard in all its instances, built, ideological, etc.
Where is the state today? I mean, in globalization, how did we go from that 50s, 60s corrective to here? I mean, is it because that corrective kind of role of the state didn't work, did fail, or what happened here?
That would need several volumes of
several
historical.
Yeah.
So on a slightly different note, if we look at things globally, I mean, earlier, as you say, mid-century modernism, it was propelled by optimism about science. You have to continuously innovate, and there was no end to it. You go on continuously. Recently, with all the crises, environmental crisis, globalization problems, what you have is that a whole lot of thinkers have started to question this kind of optimism. I now think of actual scientists. They haven't grappled with the problem of what do we do with teleology? Where do we, I mean, is ethics more important than just going forward, building newer and newer things? So that's been a very important issue. Like water shortage in India, let's take a very interesting example. I mean, initially these things didn't matter in the 60s. Now there's tremendous water crisis. So these are important issues for engineering, environmental, science, and lots of other things where attention has shifted to other things as well. And a whole lot of writings now about these, questioning strongly these ideas. I mean, this, it's happening both in arts and sciences. So I think that's an important dimension we need to think about the present day,
Right.
I'd like to add something to Sunil's point, if I could, maybe as a footnote. So when Clinton visited India, he arrived at the airport and they picked him up in a limousine and brought him straight to the Parliament building, and he gave a speech. And Mrs. Clinton was sent off to the Taj Mahal all by herself as sort of the accompanying, lady, doing the tourist stuff. And of course, she complained bitterly, about that. It was a completely different story when Obama came. So Obama came and the limousine picked him up, and they went to Humayun's tomb, which had just been, restored under UNESCO. And Prime Minister Singh and his wife met him there, along with the head of the agricultural department in India. And they had a whole tour about the grandeur and the grandioseness and how wonderful India was of the past. And after they had gotten the good dose of this history, they got back into the limo, and then Obama went to the Parliament building to give his talk. And I think these, the moments, it's about 10 years difference, is remarkably, accurate, if you will, in positing the rise of a type of historical consciousness within the nationalist project in India, for sure, but one that also had become quite global, right under the guise of liberalism. So this is the point. We see these things as sort of extreme nationalism, but this often happened with the acquiescence of the liberal intelligentsia. So in other words, who doesn't want history to be valuable? And people sort of didn't complain that, certain buildings had all of a sudden become national symbols. people don't complain that Jomon archaeological sites in Japan purely as instruments of the nation state. It's a confusing attitude that many liberal intellectuals had, because they wanted, these historical things to be valued and be preserved, and this all sounded very good. But then you have to look who's paying the bill. And all of a sudden, no one seemed to really notice that for a long time. And now all of a sudden, people are getting a little uncomfortable, as they should, but they should have gotten uncomfortable, 20 years ago.
I'm speculating as to what would have happened if Donald Trump had visited Modi.
He did.
He did. So what was his trajectory?
It was a stadium event.
There you go.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I want to shift to some of the questions that are populating our columns over here. One of the questions that is very specific is that with all its faults, modernism's social idealism, the question asks, at its core, made a language of its theory very relatable to practice, or it was a recognizable and coherent language, a kind of an idiom, which a lot of the profession shared. So it was a language of theory that could be used without much effort. It's provided as sort of a synthetic language. This is no longer possible now for our architectural theorists over here. Has the rejection of modernism created a crisis of theory within the profession? Are we like all over the place today in architecture because of the dismantling of modernism? And I suppose, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I mean, of course, it's created a crisis of theory. I think the crisis of theory began with modernism itself. We think of modernism as a univalent type of thing, right? Once it started, it was sort of self-obvious what it was. But I think already with your book, it's quite clear that no one had a clue, really. Yeah. How do you actually theorize it? And there were already very conflicting, types of projects, depending on where you were and who your teachers were, and so forth and so on. And postmodernism just, was sort of, fed up with a particular strand of it that had become dominant for sure. And, the critique of postmodernism, just kept the cycles sort of going. So the crisis of theory is not anything particularly new. There's no doubt that the proliferation, if you will, of intellectual circles in the academic globalization environment in the last a decade or so has made it difficult to sort of identify, well, that's one more important than another theory. And that's more the crisis, is not the absence of what we might call theory, even in the big T or little t, but that there are many voices, which actually is good, I would say.
So the sort of crisis of modernism opens up other opportunities for voicing. Any limitations to that argument, or is absolute pluralism always a good thing?
No, of course, there are huge amount of limitations. Absolute pluralism is probably not a good thing, but it's always connected to power structures, right? Which institutions are trying to control which types of narratives. So you see the AA trying to do something, or you see this school or that school, trying to centralize, their things as they necessarily should. That's what the universities are there to try to do. But there's, no doubt that from in the last 10 or 15 years, there's a plurality of writers, plurality of readers, and of approaches. It takes a little bit more of a discerning eye, a little slow down a little bit more to take in the flavors. Not all of them are good or palatable, but there certainly has to, rather than before where you'd read Gideon and you're done, right?
Yeah, that was the truth.
I'm not an architect or architectural theorist or historian by any means, but it just, going back to your question earlier about the shift in environmental consciousness and the recognition of some of the environmental costs of modernism. Of course, part of that is associated with what has been the primary material of architectural modernism, which is concrete. And concrete was this kind of universal material that allowed the sort of Esperanto ambition of modernism to kind of realize itself with the same fine edges and ways of building, that you could do this anywhere. Whereas now, if there's more of a turn to environmentally sustainable materials, more local materials, more what is to hand, perhaps it's actually a moment of potential great inventiveness in modernism is it has to move away from its traditional palette of building, or its historically inherited palette of building anyway, to find more particular ways of realizing the kind of wider ambitions that impel it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a critique and advance and transformation of modernism through its limitations, it's what materials it used and what materials we should be using now. What are the ways of constructing we used and what are the ways of constructing we should be using now? But that's a kind of a moving sort of a critique of the discourses of modernism. Now, are we to think that this sort of pluralization, if you want, of the modernist question, both aesthetically and I suppose ethically, in terms of its processes? I mean, if the question of using better materials, if the question of working ecologically and sustainably, this is an ethical question, right? I mean, how do we sort of do the work better? And then, but then also, does pluralization and simply multiplying all kinds of possibilities of being and representing and aesthetics, how do we parse between these two things? Whereas,
well, I don't want to be careful with the multiplication argument, because that always is usually bugaboo. If we want to take, let's say, Aboriginal theoricity valid, which becomes increasingly an important voice, especially in the sustainability argument and in materials and so forth. There's some excellent theorists, both in architecture and philosophy, who are Aboriginal or Native American, who have very interesting things to say. It also means one has to sort of silence predecessorial voices. So something has to get silenced in order to allow these voices a place at the table. And often those predecessorial voices do not want to shut up. So that's where the role of activism has to come in order to say, listen, you got to let them have a chance to work this thing through. Same for feminists, feminist voices and gender voices as well. Often these things have been so excluded that, it's hard for them to find the publication houses, the conferences, the whatever it is that allows them in. And so that means the sort of activist leader has to sort of allow that so it's not just, pluralism, because there's a valuization issue that has to be addressed, right? Which is historical in how theory has been done and promoted in the last, whatever it is, 500 years.
How do you distinguish between enabling and giving an opportunity to voices that have been traditionally marginalized or silenced, and other voices which try to recolonize the discourse through, arguably ideological, narrowly focused interpretations of a broad discourse? Is one to accept, let's say, reductive neo-nationalisms along with creating a platform for diversity of voices? Is that a necessary thing that goes with it? Is that what you're saying, Mark?
And those have to be silenced. That's why that's the role of activism, is to make sort of hard decisions. What has to get silenced in order to allow this quieter and the newer voices to be heard? And that's where some spine has to enter into the fray. And so it's not about just many voices, because that's never been the case, right? Mm-hmm. So we have many more now, but they also need to be supported and have a chance to make their own mistakes and speak their own causes, and let's hear it out and let's have a debate about it and let's see what transpires. So,
but there are also some really serious ethical questions that arise precisely because of the nature of these voices and the common sense that many of these new voices, which have been suppressed. This is why I'm not so keen on the idea of silencing. I'm on the idea of rereading and re-understanding. There was a moment where, for example, Charles Davis, who's a very strong intellectual historian of Black architecture, Black ideology, who, he picks up on the fact that much of the teleology-based modernism in terms of progress is based on Spencerian and evolutionary and racially exclusionary formulations. And so you can go back, and he has this wonderful book on character where he goes back and reads Viollet-le-Duc. He reads a lot of other of the, all the way through to Sullivan. And you realize that Sullivan and Whitman actually, in their evolutionary modernism, want a white America. They don't want a plural America in any way. So by rereading the voices of modernism, you don't have to exclude them from history, but you can place them in history in a way that begins to evolve an aesthetic, an ethical understanding of theory in relationship to truth and consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a question that's risen up over here in our Q&A over here, which goes back to our favorite chairs, the Chandigarh furniture. The question really says is that this furniture is sold and evaluated as branded Pierre Jeanneret, Perriand, and Corbusier items, rather than, I suppose, the work of marginalized, silenced, not marginalized craftsmen who were sort of putting together this furniture kind of in almost with an ethic, or I would argue, of almost a street furniture kind of a way of working. Those two things, those two very different voices, is it enjoying that kind of evaluation because of its claimed fidelity to Jeanneret and Corbusier, or is it because of its handcrafted local voicing? I mean, if it is about the local voicing, shouldn't the furniture be indexed to the local craftsmen?
That's why we're all educators. We're there to point out the fact, as Dorfles pointed out, kitsch in the early consumer patterns of modernism. We're here to point out questions of labor, questions of sweat equity in chair making, questions of taking away the kind of imprimatur of market aesthetics from a whole range of constructs, so that not that they're devalued, they're revalued in a way that allows us to understand the broader understanding of humans in relationship to their objects.
Partha, isn't this an art question? Aren't you isn't it the furniture enjoys such high valuations while the buildings are getting demolished because furniture is movable like a painting and therefore can be sold? Is that what it is?
It is a very complex question, as you can understand. But one of the things is, of course, sellable value and market value, of course. I mean, that also can be easily sold. Architecture is there. You can't simply buy or sell. So there's an aspect. But there are so many. One thing I want to go back to, this whole issue of the vernacular and the voices which are not usually heard. Tony mentioned, was it Tony or Mark, about Indian, Native American or similar sort of voices. But one interesting point is that there are this kind of indigenism, I might say, on both left and right. So this is an interesting issue. I mean, the whole problem often was termed as primitivism. You do find it in the extreme form in Germany during, the Nazi period. And then, of course, also radical, very ethical kind of movements as well. So it's an interesting problem. I mean, it's double-edged, I think. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I mean, because there is the problem of ethics and the whole thing about modernism. Yeah. Environment is coming into it. And ultimately, craft would have an important ethical dimension as well.
Is mid-century modern, does it have off lessons to offer us today? I mean, how do we sort of carry forward the learnings of the experience of that time into certainly architectural practice today as we look at the world? There are two aspects to this. I mean, we've been talking about this. There is the modernist idea of critique, right? I mean, how do you sort of produce work and how do you think about it? How do you locate it in the world and how it is critiqued within its discourses? But there is also the modernist aesthetic. There is the modernist sort of visual culture. and its claims. Those two things, is it worth forward? How do we forward those two questions today? Can we keep one and leave the other? Can we say that the modernist critique still continues to run its course and should continue to run its course, and obviously integrate itself into critical questions of environment and sustainability, but that its aesthetics can be put aside, or do the two things go together?
I mean, I don't know if I can jump in here, but I would guess, also just trying to connect it back to this moment in India. I mean, part of the critique of modernism must also be self-critique, and presumably that's the kind of the learning loop. But what that self-critique draws on is history, and so going back to the question of what's happened to theory and what are the resources it gives us. Well, I mean, maybe what the Indian experience is showing, and I think your book helps us to see also, is that the Indian experience is now an accumulated history of certain experiments with modernism. And that's now a resource for practitioners and thinkers and intellectuals to draw on, to develop a kind of, self-critique of what that project was, and from there to be able to move forward. And so I think it's a very interesting moment for us in India, because we now have a sufficiency of historical experience with this type of work, and now the beginnings of a kind of scholarly and intellectual engagement with that experience. And again, I think the book on Vikramaditya Prakash really helps with that, to sort of spark a much deeper debate about architecture as a kind of, not just as something that's built, but as a kind of lightning rod for the social historical moment of a society, and where it has been able to bring about broader transformation, and where it's simply been a hollow shell of that. Because the Indian historical experience is actually quite big and expansive, there's a way in which that can speak to the kind of global discussion as well. It's not just a local experience in that way. It's actually a pretty large and substantial one.
What do you mean? What do you mean over there? What's the echoing there of the Indian to the global?
I mean, I suppose what I mean there is that instead of seeing as the India as an instance of experiments with modernism, India as actually a kind of primary laboratory of where these experiments were going on, and therefore to make much more use of that history and reflection on that history to rethink the whole theoretical and practical project of modernity, rather than seeing it as a kind of outlier, an interesting outlier, but rather as kind of fundamental to the very project.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think that's a great point, Sunil, which is that, the Indian case, I would argue, and I think many people would, that was a serious, determined, and wide-ranging, as you said, engagement and critique of the modernist project. And in that sense, produced, including in the work of my father, Aditya Prakash, and many other people of his generation, and even later, a lot of people in architecture, but also in other disciplines, an ongoing body of thinking around how that project is to be continued and critiqued, which should continue to inform us today, right? And I have to be honest, I haven't lived in India now for 2 decades. But it seems to me that the project today doesn't seem to be a continued critique of that work, where it's many ways the project today sets itself up as a discarding of that project, right? As a disavowal of the modernist world, rather than a critique.
But isn't that where we come in terms of historians and cultural critics? That it's our work to gradually bring into focus not just the historical value of these constructions and their internal developments, but also the cultural questions that they raise and the position that they hold within the history of a nation that's entirely unfinished. It doesn't end with today. It goes on. What I'm particularly impressed with is my students. I have a group of students at Yale who are from Ahmedabad, and they're doing the most extraordinary work in drawing and analyzing and constructing the history of the stepwells all around and through the region, analyzing the water resources from medieval times to the present, and in fact have encouraged many municipalities to bring back what have become obsolete and stagnant wells into occupation. And this comes from a modernist school, Doshi, beginning to understand that that modernism has an environmental consciousness as well as and after all, we are told that Brise Soleil were a very interesting alternative to air conditioning, and at certain seasons at least. And so I think there is an ethical, environmental question deep in modernism that can be applied to extended understanding of the environment and the built environment historically.
I see both Mark and Partha sort of have their hand up. Mark, do you have your hand up?
My response was basically, thinking of Sunil's, comments a little bit. When you started, you talked about high altitude modernism and a critique of that, which was, of course, very appropriate for any number of reasons. And then I was thinking, well, in some sense, what we have today is low altitude modernism, KPF and God knows what, just sort of, anybody can do modernism and you don't need the utopian juice, in the tank or the gasoline in the tank. But, if I read, Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World by Yunka Porta. So this is one of these amazing voices. He's an Aboriginal philosopher from Australia. And he basically says, that, communitarian ethos of modernity, it's a good beginning. But basically, when the architects come and build their schools, they don't talk to the ancestor stones. They don't ask the village spirit if it's okay to do this. And, to do that, to talk to the ancestor stones, you can't just show them a plan and say, this is really good for you, right? Even if it's built out of local materials, right? You got to sit there and you have to spend a week or a month or maybe a few years until the ancestor stone replies. And so he said, this just takes a whole different attitude of how to understand nature as living and as creative and as a part of the communication, not as just the fill-in, around buildings. And so these are really interesting voices because they challenge all of us and remind us how, extremely fast architecture likes to operate. And in some sense, what he's saying is that, it's not that we need super view, not that we need to be local, but we have to be sort of sub-local in a way, right? We have to really take the time to listen to what the ancestor stones have to say, and this is not anthropology, right? That's how, anthropologists would say, oh, you have to be an anthropologist. No. You have to be a part of the conversation. The conversation exists. It's just that you're out of it. And that's a challenge to us as architects because it's not how traditionally we've tended to operate, and I'm not going to go to Australia and build a school for him and spend 10 years of my life. I can't do that. But I can understand that might be something to ask our students or something, just to remind us that this is a way that would, it's not a positive ethics where you should do this, but it's anomalous ethics where you should do no harm. And the first question is, well, what does it mean to do no harm? And that is something.
One of the interesting problems with modernism, modern art, modernism, is of course the canon and the problem of incommensurate time. It's the center-periphery problem. So artists from outside outside Euro-America, it's not West, the whole of it, the center, as seen as the kind of originary kind of creator of modernism. So all the other, African, Asian, Latin American artists, they are trying to catch up. Is that two different time frames. And there have been really strong critiques of this by people like Khilnani, that getting on and off modernity. And Octavia Paz was, talked about, it's another modern, we only see it from afar. We're not part of that because of this kind of Hegelian view of history. Now, in India, in contemporary art, particularly a number of radical artists, movements, Rax Media, they had, actually produced a very fascinating,
fantastic,
of this time. It's a very different way of looking at time and challenging the whole, Western view of time and chronology. So that is another issue of denying history. I mean, I personally do not feel that solves all the problems. But what I would say, it's a very important expression of this questioning of the, again, Western progressivist teleology and Hegelian art history.
Yeah, we're producing these critiques of center and periphery notions of modernism, whether it sort of originated in the West and traveled out, or whether it was, or rather that it was constructed through in a global crucible as a post-colonial cosmopolitan event. And we can do these critiques and we can generate these critiques. And we are working towards better voicing not only of more ecologically sustainable practices, but also of trying to foreground, marginalized voices in various theaters. And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of patience, as you are pointing out, Mark. But there's a question which is here now at the top of our list over here, which is to say, but is it not true that we have now entered into, a sort of a massive globalization in the sense of economic globalization, consumerism driven completely. I mean, we were always, in a sense, in a capitalist moment in the 19th and 20th century. But is it not true that now we are in a moment where the sort of forces of consumerist architecture are maximal? Does the critical modernist discourse stand a chance any longer? Is it too late?
Too late.
Go ahead, Mark.
No, it's too late. That's it.
Too late. That we're done.
Only thing that's left, if you will, is to, in some sense, theorize, historicize the belated problem, belatedly.
Okay.
I would agree.
I don't know.
We're in a position now where the modernist discourse, as it comes to us packaged by the modernists, has to be completely understood, reinterpreted. Its underbelly is exposed to the air. It's all the things that swept underneath the rug pulled out. And I think it's the voices that Mark is talking about, whether they're indigenous, whether they're pointed racial criticisms or gender or intersectionality criticisms or coloniality criticisms. They all have to have their way with the way in which the quote unquote canonical modernists formulated the kind of modernist discourse that we've received. And we've received actually largely through modernist historians, all the way through Banham. And even the Framptons and Cahoons of this world were basically modernists. And we've received it. They've written the history of their own people, so to speak. And I think that it's up to us to reformulate. It's slightly difficult for someone of my generation because I was brought up in it and was part of it for a long time. But I still have a lot of years to live, so I'm intending to support and develop this discourse with as many voices as I can bring on board. So there I am. I did want to say one thing, though, before we go away, which we haven't talked about. It's a superb book, Vikram. It's a book which has such power in terms of its understanding of what it's talking about and both the subject and the objects, but it also has an incredible sensitivity and an ability to pull back from its subject, which is very rare for a biography of a son writing a biography of a father. I mean, I'm sure that my voice, if I wrote about my father, would be really, really much more prickly shall we say, for obvious reasons. But I think you've managed to be a scholar, to be a historian, to be a narratologist, and to bring us the life of someone through not only his eyes, but his works, but in a way that I think has, in fact, brought a lot of the questions that you've given us today. So I just wanted to say it's a great book, and I loved reading it again in preparation for this afternoon.
Thank you, Tony. Go ahead. Sunil,
I just wanted to jump in. I mean, I entirely agree with what Tony's just said about your book, but I don't agree at all that it's too late. I mean, I think precisely because this kind of work is being generated in India, while it might be it might be too late in the West in a sense, or there's a sort of tiredness about this discussion in the West. I think in India, we're actually just moving into a moment of a very vigorous discussion about this. And I think, part of that discussion has been prompted by loss of destruction. So whether it's the Pragati Maidan, buildings that were built in the 1970s, whether it's what's happening in Central Vista today, that is provoking a kind of crisis in a variety of different domains. And out of that, I think, can a much more interesting discussion and reinvigoration occur. I mean, if you think of the parallel in politics, the emergency in India when democracy was suspended for almost 2 years produced it looked like the end of democracy. It was too late. India was going to go the way of all other post-colonial nations. What it did, in fact, when it ended, was it reinvigorated democracy. It actually came back with much more power. The courts had more teeth. So I think these things, go in their own rhythms. And so I don't think there's a teleological inevitable lateness or ending to the story. And I think, what happens in India, the kind of historical engagement, the particular looking at individuals, as your book does, and the way in which modernism, in this sense, permeated and infiltrated every aspect of someone like Aditya Prakash's life. Absolutely. I mean, I think that those sorts of biographical accounts, as well as the more large-scale efforts, I think are part of what's generating a very interesting potential conversation in India.
Yes, thank you. I would agree with that. Partha?
I just want to say a few words, very personal impression. I mean, reading that book gave me so much insight into an amazing person, but also that period, that the whole interaction between the individual, Aditya Prakash as an architect, as well as someone who is living through the beginning of independence. Now, to be slightly autobiographical, I mean, I was born before, at the twilight of empire, before independence. And I'm now thinking about, this is the time thinking about my own life, and it's been a long life. And what I found, lots of things, parallels, I sort of love reading. I mean, his, having education and going to England and really responding also to English culture, European culture, very I loved reading. I mean, he was so interested in operas and other things, but also coming back to India and really being engaged, engaging with that period. It's a very exciting period. And I would say it's an exemplar of proper decolonization. That's the beginning. And how one does it by interacting and not rejecting things, but to have positive approach to it. And I think it's a very interesting model because, as I say, I've been thinking about my own life, and this gives me a lot of pointers. He's older, a lot older than me, but that's not, the point. But yeah, no, absolutely, it's a revelation, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, the sensibility of the book is quite profound and a great way to think about biography generally. Part of many wonderful aspects was the last closing images of your father's studio, which are sort of like the son, after the whole trauma of your father's death, the son walking into the studio with the camera and recording sort of the daily view. This is what the studio looked like with the brushes and the paint cans open and the stuff lying about on the floor in a very big mess. And you really felt the emptiness or the absence of your father. You know, this is sort of his gaze, but your gaze at the same time, coming after all of that, reading all this stuff. And then you walk into the empty studio and you see everything that had been just sort of there when a person dies so quickly. I just felt very moved by the closing photographs in particular.
Well, thank you, all of you, for the very generous words. I mean, it is a question of how do you inherit, in one sense, a legacy, both at the personal level and at the level of the nation. And I suppose we're trying to push that into the level of modernism, which is the question today. And I have actually, I'll just take before we round up, I have a lot of his work still with me, and I have it available on my walls. So in many ways, or I have brought that archive here, and I have it over here. We thank all four of you for your generosity, for your thoughts, and for your time, and for your engagement, both with the book and with the topics that we took on today.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.